If you walk into a grocery store today and pick up a can or a vacuum-sealed package of corned beef, you'll notice something immediately obvious. There isn't a single kernel of corn in sight. No yellow cobs, no creamed corn, no cornmeal. It's just beef. Salty, pink, tender beef. So why on earth do we call it corned beef? Is it a marketing trick? A mistake? Or is there something deeper hidden in the history of our language? To find the answer, we have to travel back over 1,000 years, long before the golden vegetable we call corn was even known to the people of Europe. You see, the word corn didn't always mean the stuff that grows on a cob. In Old English, the word corn was a generic term used to describe any small, hard particle or grain. If you had a handful of sand, those were corns of sand. If you had a handful of salt, those were corns of salt. Even small seeds were referred to as corns. When Europeans eventually crossed the Atlantic and encountered the tall, leafy stalks of maize in the Americas, they didn't have a name for it, so they called it Indian corn, which basically meant the grain of the Indians. Over time, in North America, we just dropped the Indian part and started calling the vegetable itself corn. But in the rest of the world and in the history of our food, the original meaning stuck around. When we talk about corned beef, we aren't talking about the vegetable. We are talking about the corns of salt used to preserve it. In the 16th and 17th centuries, before refrigerators existed, preserving meat was a matter of life and death. If you wanted meat to last through a long winter or a voyage across the ocean, you had to cure it. The most common way to do this was to pack the meat into barrels with massive, coarse grains of rock salt. These salt crystals were often the size of actual corn kernels. Because the beef was being treated with these corns of salt, the process became known as corning. But the story of corned beef isn't just a lesson in linguistics. It's a story of high-stakes trade wars, massive empires, and a series of events that turned a small island into the meat processing capital of the world. That island was Ireland. In the mid-1600s, Ireland was a land of cattle, but the Irish people themselves rarely ate beef. To them, cows were far more valuable alive than dead. They were used for pulling plows, and they provided milk, butter, and cheese, the staples of the Irish diet. Beef was a luxury reserved for the ultra-wealthy or for special religious festivals. However, the British, who controlled Ireland at the time, had a massive appetite for beef. Ireland became a giant ranch for the British Empire. Tens of thousands of live cattle were shipped across the Irish Sea to England every year. But this created a problem for English cattle farmers. They couldn't compete with the cheap Irish imports. To protect their own farmers, the British Parliament passed the Cattle Acts of 1663 and 1667. These laws were devastatingly simple. They made it illegal to export live cattle from Ireland to England. Suddenly, Ireland was flooded with cows that they couldn't sell. But instead of giving up, the Irish entrepreneurs of the 17th century found a loophole. The law banned live cattle, but it didn't say anything about processed meat. And Ireland had one secret weapon that England didn't: salt. At the time, England had a very high tax on salt to fund their various wars. Ireland, however, had a much lower salt tax. This meant that Irish producers could import high-quality salt from places like France and Spain for a fraction of the cost. They realized that if they slaughtered the cattle in Ireland, packed the meat into barrels with those large corns of salt, and shipped the finished product, they could make a fortune. The city of Cork in Southern Ireland became the epicenter of this global trade. It was perfectly positioned with a deep water harbor, and soon it was the largest corned beef port in the world. This wasn't just a local snack. Irish corned beef was the fuel of the age. It fed the British Navy as they explored the globe. It was shipped to the Caribbean to feed workers on sugar plantations. It was sent to the American colonies. If you were on a ship anywhere in the Atlantic in the 1700s, chances are you were eating beef that had been corned in the city of Cork. Ironically, while Ireland was producing the world's best corned beef, the Irish people still weren't eating it. It was an export product, too expensive for the average farmer who was struggling under British rule. They continued to eat their traditional diet of dairy and eventually potatoes. When they did have meat, it was usually salt pork or bacon, which was much cheaper than beef. So, if the Irish weren't eating corned beef in Ireland, how did it become the most famous Irish dish in the world? To answer that, we have to move forward to the 19th century and cross the ocean to the crowded streets of New York City. Between 1845 and 1852, the Great Famine struck Ireland. Millions of Irish people were forced to flee their homeland, and many of them ended up in the tenements of Lower Manhattan. They were poor, they were hungry, and they were looking for a taste of home. Back in Ireland, their comfort food was a dish of boiled bacon and cabbage. But when they got to America, they realized that pork and bacon were surprisingly expensive. However, they noticed something interesting about their neighbors. The Irish immigrants often lived in the same tight-knit neighborhoods as Jewish immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe. These Jewish families had their own traditions of salt-curing meat, but because of their religious laws, they didn't eat pork. Instead, they used beef, specifically a tough, inexpensive cut called the brisket. Jewish delis were everywhere in the Lower East Side, and they sold a product that looked and tasted remarkably similar to the salt pork the Irish remembered from home. It was salty, it was cured, and when you boiled it for a long time, it became incredibly tender. This was the Jewish version of corned beef. The Irish immigrants started buying their meat from Jewish butchers. They took this new corned beef, brought it home, and threw it into a pot with the cheapest vegetable they could find, cabbage. And just like that, an American legend was born. The dish we associate so strongly with Ireland today, corned beef and cabbage, is actually a beautiful fusion of Irish and Jewish cultures that could only have happened in the melting pot of New York City. Even the pink color of corned beef has a bit of science and history behind it. If you just used regular table salt, the beef would turn a gray, unappetizing color as it cured. To keep it looking fresh and pink, producers started adding a small amount of sodium nitrite. In the old days, this happened naturally because of impurities in the rock salt, but today it's a deliberate part of the process. It doesn't just help the color, it also prevents the growth of dangerous bacteria, allowing the meat to stay safe for months or even years. Today, the world of corned beef has split into two very different paths. On one hand, you have the artisanal deli-style corned beef, the kind you find piled high on rye bread with mustard. This is the descendant of that Jewish-Irish fusion in New York. On the other hand, you have tinned corned beef, which became a staple during World War I and World War II. It was the ultimate war meat, indestructible, portable, and high in protein. For many people in places like the Philippines, Guam, and the Caribbean, tinned corned beef is a beloved part of their national cuisine, a lingering legacy of global trade and military history. So, the next time you see a plate of corned beef, you're looking at more than just a meal. You're looking at 1,000 years of linguistic evolution, from the corns of salt in a medieval barrel to the Indian corn of the Americas. You're looking at the remnants of 17th century trade wars and the ingenuity of Irish merchants who refused to let a British band stop their business. And most importantly, you're looking at a story of immigrants, Irish and Jewish families living side by side, sharing their traditions and creating something entirely new. It's a reminder that the names of our foods often hold secrets. Corned beef might not have any corn in it, but it has something much more interesting: the story of how we survived, how we traded, and how we came together. From the salt mines of Europe to the delis of New York, it's a small, salty grain of history that has traveled the entire world just to end up on your plate. The industrialization of corned beef didn't stop with the invention of the tin can. In the late 19th century, as the British Empire expanded to its greatest extent, the demand for portable, non-perishable food skyrocketed. This led to the creation of massive meat-packing plants in South America, particularly in Uruguay and Argentina. These countries had vast pampas, fertile grasslands perfect for raising cattle, and soon they were supplying the world with millions of cans of Fray Bentos corned beef. This brand became so ubiquitous that during the World Wars, British soldiers referred to their tanks as Fray Bentos because they felt like they were trapped inside a giant tin of meat. This global spread is why you find corned beef in the most unexpected places today. In many Pacific Island nations, corned beef is considered a prestigious food, often served at weddings and traditional ceremonies. It was introduced by Western explorers and later by the U.S. military, but it was the local people who integrated it into their own culinary traditions, creating dishes like palusami, where corned beef is wrapped in taro leaves and cooked in coconut milk. It's a fascinating example of how a preservation method designed for 17th century sailors eventually became a symbol of status and celebration on the other side of the planet. Even the way we cook corned beef today has changed. While the traditional method involves hours of slow simmering on the stovetop, the advent of the pressure cooker and the modern slow cooker has made this tough cut of meat more accessible than ever before. The science remains the same, though. The salt and the slow heat break down the tough connective tissues in the brisket, turning what was once a cheap, discarded cut of meat into a melt-in-your-mouth delicacy. It's a process of transformation, taking something hard and making it soft, taking something simple and making it complex. When we think about the future of food, we often focus on high-tech innovations and lab-grown alternatives, but there's something to be said for the staying power of corned beef. It has survived empires, outlasted trade bans, and bridged the gap between different cultures and religions. It is a food born of necessity, refined by commerce, and beloved through tradition. It tells us that as much as the world changes, our fundamental need for food that is reliable, flavorful, and shared with others remains the same. So, as you take that last bite, remember that you aren't just eating beef. You're participating in a global tradition that spans oceans and centuries. You're tasting the corns of salt that once preserved the dreams of explorers and the hopes of immigrants. And while there might not be any actual corn on your plate, the story behind the name is far more satisfying than any vegetable could ever be. It's a story of human resilience, one salty grain at a time.